Morning, everyone. Happy Friday. Today is February 17th, 2023, and thank you for joining us for this edition of Research Live. My name is David Mitchell, and I'm the managing editor in the Office of Research Communications. And today we've got the third event in a 5-part Research Live series on how not to research alone, creative, meaningful relationships with funders. And the title for today is Fill the Gaps in Your Foundation, Tips for Seeking Foundation Funding. Some background. Research Live webinars are intended to provide UGA investigators with timely, practical information to support your work, and we'll do our best to meet that goal today. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping points. When we take questions following the presentation, you can ask your question through the Q&A or through the raise hand function. You should see those options along the bottom of your Zoom window. If you raise your hand, we'll assume you want to ask your question by voice. And I'll call on you by name and enable your microphone while you ask your question. We'd also love to hear any feedback you have about today's session, including suggestions for future topics. The Research Live page on the Office of Research website has a suggestion form that you can access through a red button at the top of the page. We encourage you to make use of that. I'll drop the URL for that page into the chat window in just a bit. With that, I'll go ahead and introduce the panelists we've got with us today. We've got Matt Pruitt, the Director of Foundation Relations and Development and Alumni Relations. Larry Hornak, Associate Vice President for Integrative Team Initiatives, Office of Research. Jake Moss, Director of Proposal Enhancement in the Office of Research. And Richard Potter, the Director of Business Engagement and Collaboration. And I'll turn it over to Matt to get us started here. Matt, it's all yours.
Hey, thanks so much, David, and thanks for folks joining live and those maybe watching once this is recorded. I am the Senior Director now of Foundation Relations. And briefly before I start, it may be helpful to kind of get you oriented and let you know that we are housed in the Division of Development and Alumni Relations. A lot of people either don't know that we're here, and that's something I hope to remedy today. And if they do know that we're here, sometimes they think that we're kind of tied to sponsored projects or the research enterprise. We do work closely a lot of times with our friends from sponsored projects and closely with the Office of Research, but we are distinct and have a slightly different mission and slightly different target audience. And so I hope to share a little bit more about that with you today. The goals I have for today, I'm going to try to keep it pretty brief and leave some time for questions. As one, to provide a brief overview of the foundation landscape. Maybe some folks are more familiar with seeking private foundation funding as opposed to federal agencies or the mission-based agencies, but to try to give you a little bit of an overview of what foundations are like and what they're looking for. Secondly, to discuss some keys to successfully engaging foundations, how we go about submitting and developing successful proposals and getting those in. And then last but not least, and actually most importantly, is to share the ways the Office of Foundation Relations can help. If you don't take anything else away from this presentation today, I hope you take away that we're here, and I hope that you'll reach out to us if you're interested in seeking private foundation funding. All right, so some context here that I think is going to be useful. When I talk today about foundations, I'm going to be making some generalizations about organizations that are kind of hard to generalize sometimes, right? So these foundations are going to vary widely in their size, their mission, their operating procedures. When I first got into this work, somebody said, as opposed to the saying, if you know one foundation, you know them all, I was told, if you know one foundation, you know one foundation, right? So some are going to have a large professional staff that you're obligated to work with, and some are going to operate a little less formally. That large staff, the larger ones tend to have a little more distance, a little more anonymity, and the less formal ones, sometimes you can reach out and get a person on the line, which obviously helps matters. Some are going to be highly localized in terms of the geography they work with. There are foundations that really focus on cities. Some in Atlanta, they really just want to fund Atlanta ventures. Some that work in the state of Georgia, some that work regionally, all the way to ones that are trying to have an impact globally. And then, for instance, the last bullet point there to talk about some of their processes, it's important to know what the process is like in terms of, do we have one shot a year to get a submission into these folks? Or maybe do they have multiple grant cycles, a two-stage process with a pre-proposal or LOI? So they're all a little bit different, and that's going to come into play when we talk about successful approaches a little later in the presentation. So I said that they're hard to generalize, but I'm going to make a few generalizations here. Okay. One is that foundations are looking to have some direct impact on a specific issue or a specific population. Again, a saying that I heard when I got into this work was, foundations are doing what they do because they want to save lives or change lives. So the point there is that there's typically a human impact at the end of their work that we want to be cognizant of, and that it's our job to kind of help them fulfill if we want their funding. I would say the thing to note though is that they do work incrementally. It's not necessarily they're trying to solve this problem all at once in one fell swoop. More often what they're going to do is target one piece of the puzzle, one lever that they can pull that's going to advance the cause that they're most interested in. So that's the point of the graphic, is that these foundations are trying to use their funds as a lever to move the needle somehow in a certain population or in a certain issue. I want to note the asterisk there at the bottom, in case you're scared off and about to turn the presentation off. That doesn't preclude basic research necessarily. Some foundations very much trade in basic research and are interested in that. But I would say, as a general rule, foundations want to see what the ultimate impact is on people. There needs to be a lot of times a public-facing element, something that they can draw a through line to from the research to human impact, right? A couple more generalizations. More and more of these foundations have chosen some narrow target areas for their mission and their focus. And those, of course, periodically change or evolve, and we have to keep up with those. But knowing what that focus is and what that mission is and where they're trying to focus their dollars is critical to any successful foundation approach. And secondly, there on this slide, I think it's important to note that anytime we approach a foundation or seeking funding from a foundation, we need to think in terms of how what we're doing is going to help them. I know a lot of times we're very proud of our own work, and the university is doing great work, and there are individual faculty and labs that are doing incredible work, and we want to promote the work and say, hey, you should fund me because I'm doing excellent work. But when we approach a foundation, we have to think of it more in terms of what they're looking for and what they want, and realize that we're just kind of one entity that they could possibly fund. And so our job is to indicate to them, how can we help you fulfill this mission that you've decided is important and that you've decided you're going to devote your funds to. So just like those little balls on the wave, we're one of several, and we're trying to show the foundation that, hey, we're all going in the same direction here, and there's some synergy and some opportunities to collaborate and work together. And the last couple of things I would say, just in terms of some general context and information, is that the dollar amounts available do vary greatly. And I'll show you just a sample in a second here. But I would say they're typically smaller than what the federal agencies offer. So part of what I want to do here today is make that distinction between what we do and the work that maybe the Office of Proposal Enhancement does, or your friends in sponsored projects who may help you pursue a $3 million or $5 million federal agency grant that's going to take place over 3, 4, 5 years. That's typically not what foundations are going to invest in. The dollar amounts may vary, but the timelines are going to be typically shorter than what you might see in some of your federal agencies. A year is a very common one. They would typically want to give you some money, see what you can do in a year to advance the cause that they've identified as important, and then maybe go back for some additional funding or see where the relationship goes from there. Sometimes we get 2-year timelines, occasionally 3, but that's less frequent than a common 1-year timeline. Okay, so what I did here was just, and people want to say, well, when you say less than The federal agencies or the dollar amounts vary. What do you mean by that? And so I just went back and looked at some grants that we've worked on in the past year plus, right? And so you can see that these are some of the dollar amounts that we've submitted for and gotten. So anything from approaching a 7-figure gift down to $10,000 at the bottom, and lots of steps in between. I would say typically we're working in the realm of that kind of mid to high 5 figures, 50,000, 75,000, up to the 6-figure, $100,000, $200,000 grants. But honestly, it's hard to say there's a clear trend there because, again, this is just a year's worth, and these are just the ones we got, not the ones we submitted for. Okay? So you may see in UGA Today or some news occasionally we'll get some 7 figures, some high 7 figures every now and then. Those are typically for institutional priorities where the president's involved. So the ones where we're involved in driving, these are the kind of things that we can look at. I should note, just as a disclaimer, that we're a small team, 3 people when we're fully staffed and only 2 people now. So we can't always afford to spend a ton of our time down at the bottom of this graph with the $10,000, $15,000 range. We found that you can spend 10 hours on a $10,000 proposal or 10 hours on a $100,000 proposal, and it's not hard to figure out where you should spend your time there. Right? But just to give you a feel for the wide variety of foundation funding in terms of dollar amounts that are out there. I didn't bring in testimonials or anything, but again, just in terms of looking back at the past year plus and just some of the units that we've helped secure funding for, right? And you look here and you're going to see a wide variety of there, ranging from things that are more science-based, like the College of Engineering, things that have a public-facing component like public health, the arts, Lamar Dodd School of Art and the Georgia Museum of Art, and then units like Public Service and Outreach, the J.W. Fanning Institute, and not included here are institutional units like Student Affairs. So things that aren't even academic units, we help secure funding for at the university as well. So basically, and these again are just grants that we've been successful at. I had a list of ones we submitted for. It would include probably every school, college, and unit on the campus, I would think, even just in the past year or 2 years. I want to say that especially for our friends in the arts and humanities. I think a lot of times we focus on on the sciences and the STEM fields, but there are certainly foundations that are very eager to fund arts and humanities, and we solicit those as well. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the process for approaching a foundation. Again, part of what I want to emphasize here is that the best thing to do is to reach out to us and let us help you in this process. We have some special expertise, and we have some other institutional reasons for hoping to manage these approaches to foundations. But real briefly, the first obvious step would be to identify the potential foundation funders that are right for your work. And so sometimes that's just like the graphic out of the great big world of foundations, finding the one that's right for you, right? The needle in the haystack, so to speak. The good news is that there are a ton of foundations, and I've seen foundations that fund just about everything under the sun. So there's a decent chance that there's one out there that might have an interest in your work. How do we identify these funders? Well, we have access to an online database that helps us with this. It contains, in theory, every foundation out there that's operating in the country that files a 990 tax form that they all should file, and provide some information about their typical grant size and the areas they like to give to. A wealth of information that's pretty useful to us. This used to be available across campus. Unfortunately, due to budget cuts, we have a small number of accounts where we can access it, and so we usually handle the research through Foundation Directory Online is what it's called. But you can also identify potential funders too in all the ways that you can probably intuitively think of, right? You go to conferences and there's a conference sponsor or representative from a conference there. You receive newsletters from professional associations that mention these funders or support from these foundations. You have a colleague at another institution that got a grant. from a certain foundation. Word of mouth is a good way to identify potential funders. The headlines, I wouldn't say that's the most effective way. I get a lot of outreach via email or phone call saying, hey, I just saw where Duke got $10 million from this foundation. Can we pursue them too? And typically by the time that's happened, we're a little late. We've already missed the boat, right? So we want to look elsewhere, but it's still a valid way to try to identify who might be a good funder. But I'd say A there is a little more efficient in terms of letting us help identify some funders. Okay. So second, it's important to become familiar with the foundation before there's any outreach, certainly before there's any submission or solicitation. And there's a lot of questions that we want to try to answer there. Obviously, we want to know what problems they're trying to solve, so we make sure that the work we're presenting is in line or well aligned with their mission and focus. We want to think about the strategies they're using. For one, do they even support universities? Sometimes you'll look and see that's not really in their wheelhouse, and they're looking to support community-based organizations more than universities. Typical grant size, if they're only giving away $10,000 and your project needs $100,000, we don't want to waste our time there. We can see who else they've funded to get an idea of whether we're doing similar work or whether it's redundant. Maybe we shouldn't apply because they've already funded that kind of work elsewhere. The requirements for submission, we want to know what kind of investment of time we're going to make here, especially in terms of what the potential dollar amounts are on the back end. And the timeline for funding. If sometimes I'm still amazed at the long timelines between initial approach or initial outreach to a foundation and when funding may come in. It could be months or a year between the initial inquiry and when you actually get some money. So again, you want to know what the timeline is so to see if it gels with your own work timeline, right? So these are just some of the questions that we want to kind of investigate and know about before we even think about really reaching out to a program officer or reaching out to a foundation. Yeah, and so then once we have that information and we feel like we've done our homework and our research, then that's when we want to reach out and start the conversation. Again, I would emphasize that that's something that we can help with, and something we do, and I'd like to say do pretty well, is make these initial contacts and initial outreach in a way that hopefully makes the foundation want to know more and want to connect with you and your work. So part of it is identifying the correct point of contact, and that's a little different for each foundation. Some have program officers that work very specifically in one area. Some have program officers that are more generalists. Some are so small that I'm in contact with the person whose title is president or executive director. I deal with them directly a lot of times. But knowing who to reach out to is going to be important to make sure A, it doesn't get lost in the shuffle, and that B, we're talking to the person who has the ability to advance the conversation in whatever way their processes dictate. And so the initial approach is really an information sharing. Obviously, we're not going to reach out and then first contact say, hey, I need $500,000. Do you have it? When you give it to me? So we're going to try to share the information in a way that hopefully resonates with the foundation and they find intriguing, and that they can see clearly aligns with their goals and their mission. And then from there, we want to take the logical next step based on, again, their processes. For some, it might be from initial conversation to, okay, send us a proposal. Some it might be submit an LOI. Some it might be, let's talk again later with these other decision makers in the room. But just knowing how to honor and kind of follow their processes and not jump the gun is going to be important. We have to remember we're one of many people seeking their dollars, and we want to make sure we play our cards right in the process and not stop the process before it gets started. Again, making some generalizations here about some things that foundations might find compelling. Again, this isn't meant to be exclusionary, and that if your work doesn't have this, we can't find foundation funding for it. But I'd say work that's in the sweet spots. Okay, the graphic to the left there, I would say ready to launch in some ways. Work that's far enough along to show some success or evidence of likely success, but still at a point where their funds are really going to help again, pull on that lever and move that needle and make a difference. Most foundations want to know that their money is having a real impact, and not piling on a bunch of other dollars. So that's the trick in framing our work, in that, hey, we're not asking you to build the spaceship. We've got it built. We're ready to launch. If you give us an infusion of funds, we can really take this to the next level. That's where most of them like to interject themselves, I would say. Increasingly, I see foundations wanting to see collaboration, and sort of cross-disciplinary efforts, multidisciplinary efforts, even if it's appropriate and makes sense, multi-organizational efforts. So sometimes we benefit from partnering with not just other universities or higher learning institutions, but with community organizations or people who are doing work, again, kind of on the ground in an applied setting. And then often they want to see some multiple funders, right? Most of them don't want to be the only player in the game here. They don't want to, again, necessarily help build the spaceship from the ground up. Some are willing to take on more of the initial risk than others. But again, as the graphic of the little people with the pie, collaboration, both in terms of the people you're working with and in terms of funders, is typically important. And that's why a lot of times foundation funding can be a good complement to your federal agency funding or other funding that you're receiving from other sources, corporate sponsorships, anything like that. So the title of the slideshow, I believe, is filling the gaps in the foundations, and foundation funding can help fill those gaps in your funding for sure. I want to add one thing here that's not on the slide that I should have had. More and more, I hear foundations ask if what we're working on and what we're presenting is an institutional priority. Again, that doesn't mean to say that if it's not, that we can't find foundation funding. But by institutional priority, really what they mean is just somebody else besides the faculty member or the PI who's invested in it, right? Is this a priority of your college or your dean? It's even better if it happens to be a priority of the university or the president or the provost. Those are certainly things that help advance the cause in ways that they might otherwise not. Certainly foundations are willing to reward great individual work done by a faculty member and a certain lab or a certain department. But it really does help if we can frame it in terms of like, yes, my dean cares about this. This is a priority of my college, or at least my department. Even better if it's a priority of leadership at the university. That's where we tend to see the bigger dollar amounts. The more institutional investment we get, the bigger dollar amounts follow. Okay. So as we kind of bring to a close here, what's the best way to pursue foundation funding? Again, the simplest answer is to work with us. Okay? There are certain things that we can do, some expertise we have and experience we have that allow us to hopefully give you some good guidance and consultation, help identify those potential funders, and of course, provide assistance with the support and the outreach to those foundations. I should, at this point, offer a disclaimer that whenever I meet with faculty or people in various departments, I make sure to say I'm not promising that we can get you funding. That's by no means what I'm saying. I'm saying we can make it more likely and help you with the process. And I should also note that given that we are a small team, like I mentioned before, there may be times where that help is more limited than others. And we kind of have to prioritize some of the work based on a variety of factors. But I promise if you reach out, we will certainly say, here's what guidance we can give you, here's what help we can give you, and here's what we may not be able to do at this time. But having that conversation and having that initial outreach is always welcome. And again, the main point is for people to know that we're here and that we can help, and that we're happy to do so. That, I think, David, is about it.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. We appreciate the presentation. We'll take questions from anybody in our audience today. Just a reminder that you can use the Q&A function or the raise hand function. And if you use raise hand, note that we'll assume you want to speak aloud, and we will call on you by name and let you ask your question that way. One question we've got, Matt, right offhand. Can you maybe explain the difference between what would go through foundation relations and what would go through sponsored projects?
Yeah, sure. I'll give you a brief version of that answer. It could probably, I could probably spend just about as long as I spent giving the previous presentation and talking about that, because it's not always as cut and dried or simple as we might like. But typically anything that's going to have any sort of very narrowly defined deliverables is going to go through sponsored projects. The more detailed and the more rigid the budget is, the more detailed and rigid the reporting requirements are. Those all lend themselves to things that sponsored projects better set up to handle. Of course, anytime there's a quid pro quo or intellectual property rights, that's going to be something that's more in the purview of sponsored projects. So for us, on our side of the house, even though they are grants, we refer to them as gifts to indicate that they are money with fewer strings attached, so to speak, fewer requirements on the back end, and certainly nothing that might be called a quid pro quo. What counts as a deliverable is always something that we discuss and kind of have to work through. I would say that the shortest answer would be, though, that our office, my office, and sponsored projects work closely together to determine where a grant might be routed. And we try to do that as early as possible, because it's important to kind of make that determination as soon as we can. So you don't have to do that as a faculty member or someone seeking the foundation funding. We can work with our friends at SPA to determine that and get it routed the right way.
Matt, do you mind if I pile on to your answer?
Yeah, absolutely, Jake.
You can disagree with me if you want.
No.
But one thing that I've found is that there are certain foundations that have regular annual proposal or opportunities that are reviewed by review panels, often even including scientists. And I'm thinking of the Keck Foundation, the Spencer Foundation, and other ones that have a process that's more similar to something like an NSF. And in those cases, those typically go through sponsored projects. If you're looking for unsolicited, if you're going to submit an unsolicited proposal to a foundation, if you want to do that initial letter of inquiry for a foundation that maybe doesn't have a regular call, but funds, as Matt was discussing, funds in their particular areas of interest, then you definitely want to start with foundation relations, because they have the best knowledge of how to make that initial contact. Which of course it's very important to make a good first impression. So that's something you definitely want to work with them on.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. I totally agree. I think that's very, very helpful addition there. So sometimes it's very much dictated by the funder as well. Keck's a good example too. If they insist on having one institutional point of contact, and easily for what Keck funds, the most logical point of contact there is through the Office of Research and Sponsored Projects. So sometimes that determines it as well.
Great. Another question we have: can you build larger gifts if you build trust through the smaller ones with a donor?
Yeah, sure. So I mentioned that a lot of times, for instance, a foundation might have a year-long timeline where they give you a grant and say, let's see what you do with this in a year. But then certainly if you use that well, that there's a lot of times the potential to come back to that same foundation and ask for extended funding and larger funding. That's a pretty typical way that those foundations work, and something we see pretty commonly. I will also note that funding can beget funding in other ways too. If you get that $50,000 grant and use it well to good purposes, that might make it more likely that another foundation is going to fund you, and that might make it more likely that you get some attention from some other foundations too. Sometimes there's reputational concerns in there as well, right? Like if you get a grant from a prestigious foundation, that puts you on other people's radars. But the short answer is small funding definitely begets larger funding a lot of times, either with the same foundation or opens some doors with other foundations down the road. It's a good question.
Looks like we've got one more right now. How does a corporate foundation, example, the UPS Foundation, differ from a more typical private foundation like W.K. Kellogg or the Ford Foundation or anything like that?
Yeah, that's great. And what it depends on a lot of times is how separate they are. Some corporations have foundations that are really kind of distinct from the corporation and have their own mission and their own focus areas. And so those are the ones that we tend to engage with. If it's something that's closely tied to the corporation and the corporate goals, and maybe is more focused on community engagement, right? Finding opportunities for service work in the places where they have a corporate headquarters or an office. That's probably going to be more the purview of my friends in the Office of Business Engagement and their corporate relations arms. So again, that's something much like the relationship with sponsored projects. That's something we kind of can work out in-house. And sometimes people have said, hey, can we approach the UPS Foundation? And I would say, actually, that's probably more in line with what Office of Business Engagement is doing, or they manage that foundation because of the close ties with the corporation. So going back to the start, every foundation is a little different, and even every corporate foundation is not exactly the same. So yeah, they are distinct, but sometimes they fall more into our wheelhouse than the corporate relations folks. I hope that answered it. Yeah.
The one thing I'll just add to that, Matt, is if the faculty who are listening here, don't worry about, oh my gosh, do I need to make the decision whether I go to Matt, or I go to Richard, in Office of Business Engagement or sponsored programs. When you go to any one of them, as I think Matt described, they all communicate and work in harmony together, so they will direct it properly based on their assessment of where it should, where it would best be handled.
Up until about a year ago, the office was corporate and foundation relations. We were all together, year and a half, maybe a little more than that. And so, and still, my friends in the Office of Business Engagement are literally, they can probably hear my voice right now. They're literally right around the corner. So I can work that out. And again, I'm in frequent contact with our friends in sponsored projects. And so, yeah, don't stress on the front end about where that's supposed to go. We can help get it routed correctly.
Yeah, I think the key is make sure you do contact someone to get the assistance that Matt's talking about, because they're there to help.
Yeah, and for those who are still hanging on, there is one thing I want to know. I didn't want to necessarily incorporate it into the core of the presentation, but there is an institutional reason for us trying to manage the outreach to the foundations, right? And it would become pretty obvious if you think about it for just a short period of time. If a faculty member says, oh, I just discovered that the Robert W. Woodruff Foundation funds stuff that I'm interested in, I'm going to fire off a letter of inquiry to them or reach out to their program officer. Well, maybe unbeknownst to you, we've been having a conversation with the Robert W. Woodruff Foundation for months about a multi-million-dollar grant. And it doesn't make the institution look very good, doesn't make our office look very good, or you as the faculty member look very good to reach out without any knowledge of that communication. And so we describe it as air traffic control in our office. There's a lot of planes trying to land in some pretty limited places. And so we want to make sure that our communications are coordinated, that our outreach is coordinated, that we don't have anyone going rogue, as we say, and just asking for funds kind of outside the auspices of the university. Sometimes you'll come to us and ask about a foundation, and we'll say, hey, look, we have nothing going on with that foundation. We don't have any really inroads to it. You're seeking a pretty small dollar amount, so Godspeed to you, and let me know how we can help. Okay? But a lot of times we definitely want to have a hands-on role in managing the relationship with the foundation. And that's one reason that I appreciate Larry emphasizing, reach out to somebody, because I know Office of Business Engagement is much the same way. They want to make sure that these important relationships are managed in a way that's coherent and cohesive and with the best interests of the institution in mind, and not just one faculty member or lab or department.
Looks like we've got one more. Who typically reviews proposals submitted to foundations? And what have you found to be the best strategies for writing those to those kinds of audiences?
Yeah, so we do in my office. We typically review those, and I would say that in terms of strategy, the most important thing, going back to something previously in the presentation, is to make sure you're presenting your work in a way that shows how it ties into their goals and their mission and focus. And then when I talked about being ready to launch, we just talk a lot about defining the gap and showing the gap. Here's where we are. Here's what we've done. Here's the good work we want to do. Okay? And here's where your funding helps us kind of close that gap. Pretty simple formula that's used in lots of fundraising or lots of grant seeking even. But that typically is how we want to operate, and to make sure that we tell a story and that we have a narrative that kind of resonates with the folks on the other end. Foundations sometimes have rigid requirements for word length or fonts or format, much like the other agencies, and sometimes they don't. So at times you have a little more latitude to tell a good story and to make sure that you're framing it in a way that's going to resonate with the person on the other end. But knowing that audience, knowing what that foundation is about and how they operate, that's going to be key to crafting that narrative.
Awesome. Very good. Well, it looks, if we don't have any more questions, we'll kind of going once, going twice here. We'll go ahead and wrap this up. Thanks to all of our panelists, as well as our attendees for attending today. And if you need to refer back to it, the video will soon be posted on the Research Live website. Our next Research Live, which will be the fourth in the series, will be held Friday, March 3rd, and it's called "Do You Accept This Mission? Meeting the Needs of U.S. Mission Agencies." We've also got several other Research Live events scheduled through the rest of the spring. And again, just go to the Research Live website, which is in the chat right now, and you can see everything that we've got in store. So until next time, and on behalf of the Office of Research, thanks for being with us, and we hope to see you again soon. Y'all have a great weekend.